Dear listeners, welcome to the first close reading session of Martin Heidegger's Basic Questions of Philosophy, Selected Problems of Logic. In this session, I'll be reading the first preliminary chapter in which Heidegger explains the ground plan and the general ideas of his philosophical views that are gonna be important for understanding the rest of the book. As we will see, it will be really difficult, and most of the ideas that Heidegger is going to be expanding upon require somewhat detailed understanding of his whole philosophy in general. So this is going to be quite, in relation to the rest of the book, a difficult reading, and I hope that I'll be able to give enough background information and explanatory examples to give at least a general idea of what Heidegger means with everything that he says in his preliminary chapter. Without any more introductory remarks, let's get started. Chapter 1: Preliminary Interpretation of the Essence of Philosophy. 1. Future of Philosophy: Restraint as the basic disposition of the relation to being. Basic questions of philosophy. That seems to imply there is such a thing as philosophy in itself, from whose domain basic questions could be drawn out. But such is not the case and cannot be. On the contrary, it is only the very asking of the basic questions that first determines what philosophy is. Since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question. That is, if we invest everything without exception, in the question and do not merely act as if we were questioning while still believing we possess our reputed truths. In this first paragraph, Heidegger is making some remarks that he will be expanding on later in the book, but basically what he's trying to say here is that he's dealing with the problem of logic and truth is not going to be according to the traditional understanding of these problems. And when he says that the basic questions of philosophy is something that should be drawn out from philosophy itself, it means that the tradition does not necessarily ask the questions by philosophizing themselves, but it could be so that the question is understood just according to the tradition that has been delivered over. And this is going to be something that Heidegger will be explaining more later in the book. This also ties in neatly with the comments that I've made in the introductory video regarding the aims of Heidegger's philosophy. So here we see another instance of Heidegger trying to move beyond the traditional understanding of philosophical problems throughout the history of Western philosophy, and even though he does not mention phenomenology here explicitly, he still says that the advancement of philosophy should be determined by the questioning itself, and that no external factors should hamper or influence the questioning. And in this sense, we see a parallel between what I said in the introductory video and what he's trying to convey here about the scope of his engagement with the basic questions of philosophy. Moving on. The task of this brief preliminary interpretation of the essence of philosophy will simply be to attune our questioning attitude to the right basic disposition, or, to put it more prudently, to allow the basic disposition a first resonance. But then, philosophy, the most rigorous work of abstract thought and disposition, can these two really go together, philosophy and disposition? To be sure, for precisely when and because philosophy is the most rigorous thinking in the purest dispassion, it originates from and remains within a very high disposition. Pure dispassion is not nothing, certainly not the absence of disposition, and not the sheer coldness of stark concept. On the contrary, the pure dispassion of thought is at bottom only the most rigorous maintenance of the highest disposition, the one open to the uniquely uncanny fact that there are beings rather than not. The connection that Heidegger is trying to make between disposition and philosophy is essential for understanding what Heidegger is trying to do in this book. He is not simply trying to construct and to convey an abstract understanding of a philosophical problem. Neither is he trying to present an overview of different standpoints that have been developed within the history of the West in relation to this basic philosophical problem. What Heidegger is aiming to do, and he will explain this later in more detail, is he's trying to get those who are in the audience to undergo an experience, to question alongside him, and in this questioning get into the right, in English we have to say mood, and maybe even better to get into the right disposition in order to experience that which he is trying to convey. And in this sense, philosophy is not something that one can achieve or do by merely listening and merely trying to repeat the different ideas that the lecturer is presenting. Now, philosophy is something that you have to undergo yourself, and so it's more a form of an activity by which one questions. And this thinking, to comment on what he says about the dispassion and how it relates to the disposition. So he says that this passion is indeed not nothing. It is not the pure absence of disposition, but this passion is also a certain disposition, a certain relation that one takes to beings, and in the more fundamental sense, what Heidegger means here, in relation to being as a whole. So the general idea is that only with the right disposition one is able to experience what the questioning is about, and only with the right disposition one is able to perform the steps of questioning. And what this amounts to will become clearer when we go along the lecture. So for now, I wish to continue and leave the more inner workings of this questioning undiscussed. But now the next paragraph. If we had to say something immediately about the basic disposition of philosophy, that is, of future of philosophy, we might call it restraint, Verhaltenheit. In it, two elements originally belong together and are as one. Terror in the face of what is closest and most obtrusive, namely that beings are, and awe in the face of what is remotest, namely that in beings and before each being holds sway, das Sein weist. Restraint is the disposition in which the terror is not overcome and set aside, but is precisely preserved and conserved through awe. Restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being, and in it the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most worthy of questioning. Only one who throws himself into the all-consuming fire of the questioning of what is most worthy of questioning has the right to say more of the basic disposition than its elusive name. Yet, once he has wrested for himself this right, he will not employ it but will keep silent. For all the more reason, the basic disposition should never become an object of mere talk, for example, in the popular and rash claim that what we are now teaching is a philosophy of restraint. In the last paragraph of the first section, Heidegger gives a very brief and very difficult indication of what he believes the disposition should be of someone that questions with him. He says that the disposition could be called restraint. And in this restraint there are two elements that come together, namely one, terror, and the other, awe. Even though his comments are very brief and they hardly return in the rest of the book, I still wish to add some background for those of you that are interested. In the contributions to philosophy, Heidegger explains the idea in more detail. He says, to be shocked is to be taken aback, that is, back from the familiarity of customary behavior and into the openness of the pressing forth of what is self-concealing. So, similarly to what Heidegger says in Basic Questions about Terror, It is a way of experiencing the uncanniness of the world around us. Normally, we just live our daily lives and do not question anything, do not reflect on anything, and the disposition of shock and terror is a way of experiencing the ungroundedness and being confronted with the fact that we have no real clue where everything comes from, how we're able to experience the meaningfulness of everything, and our complete helplessness in the face of the world. With the disposition of terror, one is able to experience the uncanniness of the world and is transported by what is closest, namely beings, to the question of their existence and their origin. So, the disposition of terror allows us to see and to open our eyes to the question of the existence and origin of what is closest, namely beings. From there on, the disposition of awe allows us to get into the right relation to what is usually farthest, namely being, or that which allows beings to be. And the disposition of awe could be summarized as a humble devotion in which the human being is able to transform and transpose itself into the open realm where beings are allowed to be. 2. Philosophy as the immediately useless though sovereign knowledge of the essence of beings. Depending on the depth of the history of a people, there will exist or will not exist in the all-determining beginning the poeticizing of the poet and the thinking of the thinker, that is, philosophy. A historical people without philosophy is like an eagle without the high expanse of the radiant ether where its flight reaches the purest soaring. Philosophy is completely different from worldview and is fundamentally distinct from all science. Philosophy cannot by itself replace either worldview or science, nor can it ever be appreciated by them. Philosophy cannot at all be measured by anything else but only by its now shining, now hidden essence. If we attempt to calculate whether philosophy has any immediate use and what that use might be, we will find that philosophy accomplishes nothing. It belongs necessarily to the character of ordinary opinion and practical thinking always to misjudge philosophy, whether by overestimating or underestimating it. Philosophy is overestimated if one expects its thinking to have an immediately useful effect. Philosophy is underestimated if one finds its concepts merely abstract, remote and watered down representations of things that have already been solidly secured in experience. Yet, genuine philosophical knowledge is never the mere addition of the most general representations limping behind a being already known anyway. Philosophy is rather the reverse, a knowledge that leaps ahead, opening up new domains of questioning and aspects of questioning about the essence of things, an essence that constantly conceals itself anew. That is precisely the reason this knowledge can never be made useful. Philosophical reflection has an effect. If it does, always only mediately, by making available new aspects for all comportment and new principles for all decisions. But philosophy has this power only when it risks what is most proper to it, namely, to posit in a thoughtful way for the existence of man the goal of all reflection and to establish thereby in the history of man a hidden sovereignty. We must therefore say philosophy is the immediately useless though sovereign knowledge of the essence of things. To understand Heidegger's claims that philosophy is fundamentally different from worldview and science, and also in order to understand why Heidegger thinks that philosophy is immediately useless though sovereign knowledge, we must first look at what Heidegger means with the ontological difference. The ontological difference is in essence the appreciation of the distinction between beings and being. And this is a somewhat abstract idea, and since we have already talked about the phenomenological reduction and how this functions as a way of trying to answer philosophical questions, this might be a good way to try and explain what this exactly means. In the introductory video, I used the example of the difference between the phenomenological distance between my house and the train station and the objective distance that can be measured. If we take the phenomenological approach one step further, we ask ourselves how the world shows itself and how this differs between the situations in which we relate ourselves differently to the world. So, if I'm just walking towards the train station and I'm experiencing directly the distance between my house and the train station, one could say that everything that I cross and the whole experience is something that is immediately close by and does not need any reflection to be understood. I simply walk towards the train station, I wait at the traffic light, and when it shows green, I immediately start to walk without any kind of reflection. Without even noticing explicitly, I take every right turn, and at some point in time, I reach the train station. This is, of course, when everything goes smoothly, but the world can show itself in a vast amount of different ways. Already in the introductory video, I mentioned that it might be raining, and when it's raining, the walk is not easy going and waiting patiently before the traffic light. It's rather moving along hurriedly and being annoyed when the traffic light doesn't turn green initially when I get there, and the world just shows itself differently. And we can take this one step further, namely once we start to, for instance, measure the distance between the house and the train station. Now the world doesn't show itself as something that I'm moving along to get to a certain point for the sake of, for instance, getting to school. When I'm just measuring the distance between my house and the train station, the whole meaningful dimension of this is de-worlded. It is simply the distance between 2 points in space that have no relation besides the fact that I'm measuring the distance between them. And what the phenomenologist is interested in is how is it possible that these two kinds of relations disclose the world in such a vastly different way? And what Heidegger thinks is that the only way to account for this is to say that the being of the world has changed. So when we speak of the ontological difference and as the difference between beings and being, we can say that the beings in the world show themselves differently in relation to our way of dealing with them and the practices in which they are involved. And in this way, the beings can show themselves differently because their way of being changes. I'm not sure if it is even possible, but it might be easier to think of being as meaningful presence. So the way that something is meaningfully present is different between situations and different between the way in which it is involved in the world. And additionally, it is the meaningful presence that allows something to be. So it's only once something is disclosed, is unhidden, is made accessible by its meaningful presence that it can be something. And this is a very crucial step in understanding the ontological difference and also in relation to what Heidegger is going to say about the difference between philosophy and science. Now that we've gotten the ontological difference out of the way, I should still say something about the difference between philosophy and science. So Heidegger says that science and also worldview is fundamentally different from philosophy. And with the ontological difference in mind, we can now easily say that this is because science and worldview always deal with beings. So they're always already in a world disclosed and trying to grasp how and what things are. But this is fundamentally different from what Heidegger believes philosophy to be, because Heidegger thinks philosophy should only worry about being, which comes down to understanding how things are able to be and how meaningful presence can account for the being of beings. This also explains why philosophy is immediately useless, because philosophy doesn't deal with beings. It does not deal with the concrete beings in the world. in a sense that it does not try to learn how to effectively manipulate and control them. Philosophy is rather about understanding how we are even able to relate ourselves in this way to the beings and how they can be meaningfully present at all. For this reason, Heidegger is able to say that philosophy is sovereign knowledge. And this is so because philosophy, in contrast with science, does not deal with beings after the fact, after they have been disclosed. Instead, it deals with being and is concerned with the question of disclosure and meaningful presence as such. And that is why Heidegger writes that philosophy is the reverse of science, and that it has the potential of making available new aspects for all comportment and new principles for all decisions. So, in some sense, we could say that philosophy is more about opening new worlds and new possibilities, while science and worldview is merely about dealing with the beings that have already been disclosed. And now the remainder of section 2. The essence of beings, however, is always the most worthy of questioning, insofar as philosophy, in its incessant questioning, merely struggles to appreciate what is most worthy of questioning and apparently never yields results. It will always necessarily seem strange to a thinking preoccupied with calculation, use, and ease of learning. The sciences, and indeed not only the natural sciences, must strive increasingly and, it seems irresistibly, for a complete technologizing in order to proceed to the end of their course laid down for them so long ago. At the same time, the sciences appear to possess genuine knowledge. For these reasons, the sharpest possible alienation with regard to philosophy, and at the same time a presumed convincing proof of the futility of philosophy, occur in and through the sciences. Truth and science. If and only if we believe ourselves to be in the possession of the truth, do we have science and its business. Yet, science is the disavowal of all knowledge of truth. To hold that today science meets with hostility is a basic error. Never has science fared better than it does today, and it will fare still better in the future, but no one who knows will envy scientists, the most miserable slaves of our modern times. The withdrawal of science into what is worthy of questioning is the dissolution of modern science. In the remaining paragraphs of section 2, after Heidegger has indicated why and how philosophy differs from science, he is trying to explain why philosophy has become so marginalized within the academic field. And the interesting thing for us here is that Heidegger is trying to do this according to his analysis of the difference between science and philosophy. So, since science deals with beings and in that sense has a certain affective nature, it deals with beings and it makes us better at understanding how the world works, and it makes us better at manipulating certain events. For instance, with technology, Heidegger believes that these go hand in hand. So basically, the development of science and the parallel development of technology help us make our lives easier in that with these kind of understanding of the world and the technology that we develop around that, we're able to efficiently maximize certain production processes and overall just be able to master the world more efficiently. Now, what this means is that if we judge philosophy from the viewpoint of science, philosophy is understood as completely useless, and as Heidegger puts it, as something that merely finds general abstract concepts that are already known to experience. And it does not, as he's gonna say later, by quoting a certain German figure that's just trying to take away a philology professor's chair by arguing that philology only deals with the past while science deals with the future, in that it is able to predict on the basis of an understanding of how the world works what will happen in different kinds of situations. So basically what Heidegger is trying to say here is that a real kind of philosophical questioning gets harder and harder in a world, in an academic period, in which only the effective and immediately effective kinds of knowledge are valued. This means that a kind of philosophical questioning that Heidegger here is trying to attempt gets even more difficult to reach once every possibility of doing an original and truly open questioning is ever more marginalized. And furthermore, it must be stressed that Heidegger is here not arguing against science. And he even says in the passage we just read that at the same time the sciences appear to possess genuine knowledge. And this is very important in understanding Heidegger and his whole philosophical project. So he is not arguing against science or against an objective worldview, but he's merely saying that it's a limited view and just not everything or the sole way of relating to the world. And we're gonna lose a whole variety of possibilities and ways that things can present themselves at. So the range of meaningful presence is gonna be so narrow and so shallow if we're just gonna solely believe that science has all the answers. The difficulty is, however, that in a world obsessed with what Heidegger also calls ease of learning and quick gains and efficiency, it's just that science pairs up very well with that kind of understanding of what is important and what the world is. The fact remains that if you want a true and open and neutral starting point from which to understand what the world is and how beings are able to be, we do not and cannot start with the viewpoint of science that there is just beings with certain properties. But we have to stand back and do some real questioning. And this questioning cannot therefore be determined by a research-like scientific methodology, but it must go beyond that, because in that methodology is already a certain understanding of what is going to be found. And Heidegger is going to call this Besinnung, and this is going to be something that will be explained further on. So what we should take away from this section is that if we want to do some real questioning in a philosophical sense, then we should not try and judge our questioning with the viewpoints and the ideals of science, but we will stand before those ideals, and the ideals of the questioning can only be gotten from the questioning itself, because this is the only neutral standpoint from which to go on. And now the last section of chapter 1. 3. Questioning the truth of being as sovereign knowledge. Philosophy is the useless though sovereign knowledge of the essence of beings. The sovereignty is based on the goal established by thinking for all reflection. But what goal does our thinking posit? The positing of the goal for all reflection possesses truth only where and when such a goal is sought. When we Germans seek this goal, and as long as we do so, we have already found it. For our goal is the very seeking itself. What else is the seeking but the most constant being in proximity to what conceals itself, out of which each need happens to come to us, and every jubilation fills us with enthusiasm. The very seeking is the goal and at the same time what is found. Obvious misgivings now arise. If seeking is supposed to be the goal, then is not what is established as a goal actually the limitless absence of any goal? This is the way calculating reason thinks. If seeking is supposed to be the very goal, then do not restlessness and dissatisfaction become perpetuated? This is the opinion of the feeling that is avid for quick possession. Yet we maintain that seeking brings into existence the highest constancy and equanimity, though only when the seeking genuinely seeks, that is, extends into the farthest reaches of what is most concealed, and thereby leaves behind all mere curiosity. And what is more concealed than the ground of what is so uncanny, namely that beings are rather than not? What withdraws from us more than the essence of being, that is, the essence of that which, in all the fabricated and disposed beings holding sway around us and bearing us on, is the closest, but at the same time the most worn out and therefore the most ungraspable? To posit this very seeking as a goal means to anchor the beginning and the end for all reflection in the question of truth, not of this or that being or even of all beings, but of being itself. The grandeur of man is measured according to what he seeks and according to the urgency by which he remains a seeker. Such questioning of the truth of being is sovereign knowledge, philosophy. Here questioning already counts as knowing, because no matter how essential and decisive an answer might be, the answer cannot be other than the penultimate step in the long series of steps of a questioning founded in itself. In the domain of genuine seeking, to find does not mean to cease seeking, but is the highest intensity of seeking. This preliminary interpretation of the essence of philosophy will, to be sure, have meaning for us only when we experience such knowledge in the labor of questioning, therefore, basic questions of philosophy. But which question will we raise? Before I will make some closing remarks on the section we just read, I would just briefly like to mention that the more that I delve into this introduction, the more it's obvious to me that really the essence of everything that Heidegger says here is the essence of the whole book and can only really be understood once we've gone through everything. And yet it's still very important that we engage with what he says over here, and this is the ever-present hermeneutical circle that is always present within any interpretation of philosophy or a text whatsoever. By mentioning these things and by making these remarks, Heidegger is trying to attune you to the right tones that will help you understand the heart of the matter once he gets to it in more detail. And this becomes even more important once the heart of the matter is not just repeating and being able to say by heart what he has already said. Now, there is some kind of experience that must be gone through, and this experience can only be had once someone gets into the right relation to what is being said and thought. To round off this first close reading session, I would like to say more about two aspects of the last section. First of all, I'll try to briefly explain why Heidegger believes that the goal of the questioning is the seeking itself, and additionally, I'll try to explain what he means with the sentence, "The grandeur of man is measured according to what he seeks and according to the urgency by which he remains a seeker." The remarks I made on the last section will help us to understand why the essence of philosophy is the seeking itself. And this comes down to the relation between question and answer in contrast to beings and being. So if science deals with beings, and if they question, their goal is to get a clear answer so that it helps us manipulate a kind of being, or that it helps us gain an understanding of how a certain process works. But this is not the same for philosophy, because philosophy is interested solely in being, in what allows beings to be. And this is not an answer that one reaches and then allows one to control being. Now it's rather a form of what I earlier called a humble devotion. And this is something that Heidegger expresses with the disposition of awe. Additionally, Heidegger writes that to posit the very seeking as a goal means to anchor the beginning and the end of all reflection in the question of truth, not of this or that being or even all beings, but in being itself. And since Heidegger in 1936 has reached the idea that being is the self-disclosing essence of truth and therefore the most hidden and most unique basis for everything that is, he does not believe that it is something we can control and maybe not even grasp completely. This is why Heidegger writes that the grandeur of man is measured according to what he seeks and according to the urgency by which he remains a seeker. Seeking is a constant task that the human being has to take upon himself every moment and in that way get closer to his own essence, but also to the essence that allows him to be what he is himself. And this is not a goal that one reaches once one has found it, because finding it does not end the process. Even once the human being has become totally one with the being that he is, it is still something that must be lived every day. And the living in that way is always a seeking. And in that sense, the grandeur of man is measured according to what he seeks, namely being or the essence of truth, and according to whether he remains a seeker, whether he is always and in every moment trying to be one with the essence of his own being, namely one with the open in which beings are able to be. So, in short, with the first section of this preliminary chapter, Heidegger is trying to give an overview of what he's gonna attempt, and what kind of relation we should get to the kind of questioning that he is going to attempt. And he gave us some ideas of the reasons of why it is important to follow him in his questioning and to go along the steps with him. And it is good to stress that it is a very, very difficult opening chapter in which a lot of understanding of his philosophy and his goals is required in order to understand fully what he is saying here. But this is something that if you read it for the first time, you really should not get stuck on. It is more an attempt to try and give a first account of what he's gonna explain in detail more later. And additionally, it's also more of the fundamental kind of philosophical basis on which he is gonna rest the whole of his lecture. And throughout the lecture and throughout our reading, we're gonna reflect on what he said over here and try and see if the actual doing of the questioning is gonna help us understand what he means with the more fundamental understanding of philosophy that he has given here. And this is already gonna be different in the next chapter of the preliminary section, in which he's going to explain more about the question of truth and also more about the title, because the title plays an important role in what he's trying to do in his lecture course. So the title is Basic Questions of Philosophy with the subtitle Selected Problems of Logic. And what he's basically gonna do is explain why a basic question of philosophy, namely truth, is not a problem of logic that has been handed down in the tradition. And he's gonna show us how one, if one is really trying to question, can go beyond tradition and ask the question of truth as an original question. And with this second chapter, we're really gonna be entering the arena in which the whole lecture moves. So I hope the first difficult preliminary chapter has not discouraged those of you who has listened everything through to the end. And in the next chapters, it will become more focused on the question of truth, and it will go much more slowly. And there's also some recapitulation chapters, etc., which we will also read, giving us more time to talk about everything and the very many problems that we encounter along the way. So this is it for now. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this close reading session of Heidegger's Basic Questions of Philosophy, and see you on the next reading session.